Just to give you a summary, what I'm going to talk to you about today, poverty in Ireland, sort of what led up to the implementation of the workhouse system, how it was established and operated in Ireland, its role in society, and really what the records can tell us about both the staff and the inmates and the people who receive welfare from the workhouse system, and also society as a whole. So just as a quick intro, there had been provision for the poor in Ireland dating back centuries into Brehon law. Following that, the monasteries had a big role in the provision of poverty in terms of their ethos of not turning paupers away and providing refuge and food. There were a number of parliamentary acts in the 1700s which established houses of industry in Dublin and Cork, and for the relief of poverty and mainly for the care of foundling children. And in Belfast, the Belfast Charitable Society administered relief from 1752 onwards and funded a city workhouse in Belfast in 1774. So moving on, the workhouse system was established in the early 1800s, and some of you will be familiar with the Ordnance Survey memoirs, and the memoirs were really written notes on areas to go alongside the Ordnance Survey maps. So I've just taken out a few extracts, and this is the parish of, it reads Achallurcher, but I'm told by locals it's Achalucker in County Fermanagh. And it tells us the cottiers and labourers live in the most wretched way in mud huts, in many instances without either window or chimney, with in almost every case an offensive heap of liquid manure at the very entrance to their miserable abodes. Children issue from the midst of the smoke and filth, brought up by their parents, almost in a state of nudity in all weathers and entirely fed on potatoes. They marry at an early age and begin to work on their own account, building mud huts with wherever a few acres of land is to be obtained, struggling through life in poverty and wretchedness, but apparently contented and cheerful. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but I suppose these were observations taken, sort of this particular one, 1834 to 35. So that's an outside observer coming in, and I suppose this is also instrumental into what was becoming a social debate. Really, the British government assumed responsibility for Ireland after the Act of Union in 1800. And I suppose the social debate was around what was causing this poverty. Was it a Malthusian crisis in population? In the early 1840s, there were around 8 million people in Ireland. 2/3 of the people depended on agriculture, and as was referenced in that previous extract, one of the biggest problems which made Ireland slightly unique, Ireland wasn't the only place which experienced famine, but it was particularly throughout Europe, and famines and intermittent famines and crop failures were common. However, the main issue with Ireland was this complete dependence on agricultural wage and an almost complete dependence on the potato as the main source of food. So when it failed, and it failed repeatedly, this was what made it particularly significant here. You could question why there was concern and political debate around this. Some people argued, sort of on a benevolence case, this was an issue, that governance in Britain could be remedied and was causing this. Also, there was a constant stream of these poor Irish people descending on mainland shores, which no doubt also had an influence on the British government and their interest in looking into addressing this problem. So the workhouse system was introduced in 1838. There had been, as I mentioned, there were a number of commissions. The first commission was undertaken by Archbishop Richard Whately in 1833. And Whately had actually estimated that there were around 2.4 million people in Ireland who were in poverty and want for at least 30 weeks of the year. However, what he also concluded was that it wasn't due to idleness that these people were in poverty. Again, we go back to this agricultural wage and the fact that work was seasonal. So he talked about the issues with wage and earning, and that it wasn't due to idleness that the people couldn't work, it was that there was no work available. So he suggested that the English Poor Law Act, which had been implemented in 1834, wouldn't actually be suitable here, and the best remedy would actually be a subsidised scheme of public works and assisted immigration and the like, to try and provide more opportunity. This wasn't accepted, and one of the Poor Law Commissioners from England, called George Nichols, was subsequently sent over, and basically he did a whistle-stop tour of Ireland. I think he was only here for a matter of a very, very short time. Travelled around Ireland, and basically he then concluded that there was no reason that the English poor law system couldn't be applied into Ireland. And despite some consternation and query, particularly by the landed gentry who were a bit concerned as to how this was going to be financed, a bill was actually passed and introduced, and the Poor Law Act was extended, and an Irish version was implemented in 1838. So what that meant was that Ireland was divided initially into 137 poor law unions, and these unions were based on electoral divisions, with each having its own workhouse, and the workhouses largely being based in a market town. So the initial idea was that the market town would serve in approximately a 10-mile radius in the surrounds. So once this was a nice idea, this did vary drastically in regionality, and you'll find that the sort of eastern seaboard unions are a lot smaller, and you could have poor law unions in the west and the likes of Hancock, covering vast swathes of geographic territory. There was also sort of a slight debate in that when this was implemented, the consideration was largely given to Connacht and Munster in the west of Ireland, and that there wasn't really a great deal of thought given to whether there were any regional variations across Ireland in terms of provision for the poor. Present-day Northern Ireland had 27 unions, which reduced down to 26, and obviously there were changes and variations as some ceased to operate. Boards of guardians were elected and appointed into each union, and the idea was that each union was to be more or less self-financing, and that they were to be paid out of local rates based on administering to the poor in each particular locality. So this is an example from Newry Board of Guardians. It's the first minute book from 1839, where it shows us there were 31 elected guardians representing 23 electoral divisions, as well as 10 ex officio appointments. So I suppose there's two things about the elections. On one hand, it was restricted only to ratepayers, so it did effectively rule out a large majority of non-rate paying population. However, in terms of it had significant local authority. So in terms of religious bias, it was one of the first times that actually Roman Catholics were able to represent in local politics and local authority within their area. So it's actually, the Board of Guardians is quite a significant political sway also. So in terms of building of the workhouses, an English architect called George Wilkinson was commissioned to design the workhouses, and they were designed in a uniform manner, and you will see these. I'm sure most of you have actually seen one. Even if you don't know you've seen one, you probably have seen one. This is City Hospital in Belfast, or the frontage before it was altered. If anybody's familiar with Lisburn, you'll see at Lisburn Hospital the frontage of the workhouse. This was because most had infirmaries attached, and a lot of the times the site became repurposed at the end of the workhouse system into hospitals. So you will actually see lots of frontages where you can see the actual original. You can see it in Derry as well, where you can see this layout. So the idea that they were all to be standard, they were all to be uniform, they were to be economically built, and they were in essence built to deter people from coming in. One of the other comments that George Nichols, the English Poor Law Commissioner, made was that the reason he thought that the workhouse system would work here is that he thought that the Irish had a particular irksomeness to confinement, and he said more so than the Englishman. So he thought that actually an Irish person would have to be in abject want and destitution to allow themselves to be confined in this workhouse system, and that would contribute to them not abusing the system. So again, this is an extract from one of the Board of Guardians workhouse, and you can see how rich detail and how people are named, and you'll get a lot of information on local people in these minute books. So it talks about the clerk of the works being appointed to Mr. Williams has been appointed clerk of works to superintend the erection of Newry Union Workhouse in conjunction with the workhouses of Kilkeel and Banbridge Unions, and that he is to be paid a salary of £1 and 1 shilling per week from each union as long as the works in each shall proceed simultaneously, and that's dated 1841. So this is a broad plan of the layout, and again this is based on looking at Newry Workhouse, and as I mentioned, they deliberately intended the conditions to be harsh. The idea was that the conditions and the dietary conditions and the provision should be more harsh than it would be on the outside, and given the conditions and the conditions that were mentioned in that Ordnance Survey memoir report, that proved extremely difficult. So basically, families were split up when they entered the workhouse. There were 7 classifications of inmate: old men, old ladies, able-bodied men over 13 years old, able-bodied girls or women over 16 years old, boys 7 to 13, girls 7 to 16, and children and infants under 7 years old. So families were split, men and women were split. There had to be special permission given for visitation. So it was not a pleasant environment. The whole idea was that you came in for food and shelter, and that was really basically it. So as I said, ventilation and sanitation were often poor, particularly later on during the famine period when conditions became extremely overcrowded. Dormitories were basic, initially only with planks and maybe straw as a means of bedding. And again, a lot of these examples relate to Newry because there's a particularly rich source of material in that particular workhouse archive. So again, this refers to the election of the first master of Newry Workhouse, and it shows you who the 2 candidates were. It shows you the votes. So he came in by a narrow victory of only 2 votes. And the master had a very significant role. He was responsible for reading morning and evening prayers, making sure that the people who were entering the workhouse actually worked. He superintended the provision of meals, inspected paupers, and made sure that the rules and regulations were followed, and identified which boys and girls might be suitable for putting out to service, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So this is the articles of rules and regulations, and as you can see, they are long and extensive. Any pauper who shall neglect to observe such of the regulations herein contained as applicable and binding to him, make any noise when silence is ordered, use obscene or profane language, shall by word, deed or insult or revile any person. So the usual domestic characteristics. Interestingly, you also get some of the rules which should apply within the workhouse. No child under 12 years of age shall be confined in a dark room during the night. No corporal punishment shall be inflicted on any male child except by the schoolmaster, so it was okay if the schoolmaster. Corporal punishment, no corporal punishment shall be inflicted on any female child. So there was quite everything was very uniform and very regimented. And this is a letter. I know it's quite difficult to see, but this is a letter from one of the schoolmasters. So the Board of Guardians were actually responsible for appointing schoolmasters and schoolmistresses within the workhouse system. much to the consternation of the Education Board actually, which felt it should have a bit more say. And if anybody was at Valerie's talk last week, it was interesting when she talked at the beginning where schools were initially intended to be non-denominational, or that it wasn't meant to have a religious bias. Well, the same applied within the workhouse system. And actually, however, the children were educated in respect to their religion by birth. Particularly as time went on, the emphasis was most certainly on the education and preparation of children for work in service. It was only mandatory for children to have 3 hours a day in education, but there was a big onus on what those children would do when they left, so that the idea was to get them prepared for service. There was provision made in 1948 for the Board of Guardians to acquire land, for example, so that young men could be taught skills in farming and labouring, which they could then use to gain employment. And again, I'm bringing up loads of records here just to give you an example of what a variety of information you'll find in the Board of Guardians, in addition to what most people know, which are the registers. Again, this is an extract from a master's journal, and you can see what he's talking about, and this harks back to what that list of master's duties included. He was talking about feed, and you can see again, very detailed, milk register of cream, what percentage of cream and fat things were. The children are regularly exercised during the week. I beg to suggest the discontinuance of potatoes and bread substituted for the dinner meal on Sundays, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Medical officer approves. So again, very detailed annotation. This type of record gives you a real insight into both the administration side and the social side, and how concerned they were with things like nourishment in this case. And this is slightly later, it's from 1896. And it talks in the next one, the night nurse has been employed since Wednesday, taking care of the old man, James, I think that's James Walker, who stabbed himself, as reported in the medical officer's book. So not very pleasant, but again, I thought this was quite relevant because it gives some indication probably about the mental state of people when they were coming into the workhouse, and the effects of the harsh conditions, both inside and out. So anybody thinking that this was an easy ride would have been mistaken. And again, we talked about that list of rules. You can find things like punishment books in the Board of Guardian archive. So the top one says 29 women at the mill neglecting and refusing to work, denied supper and milk stopped was their punishment. Owen Traynor was stealing onions and he was flogged for that on the 1st of September 1881, I think that is. Refractory conduct, refusing to work and damaging her clothes. People were flogged. 6 hours in lockup. So you can see even for breaking the most minor of rules on some occasions that the penalties were pretty harsh. And I suppose moving on to some of the other extensions to the Board of Guardians' influence and sphere of influence. When the workhouses were built, infirmaries were built alongside the workhouses, and those were initially primarily just for the care of the sick who were inmates of the workhouse. By 1851, the Medical Charities Act had actually tried to rationalise the haphazard treatment of sick people who were not workhouse inmates, who had sort of hitherto been treated by private charities and the like. George Wilkinson, our original architect, was asked to build dispensaries. By May 1852, Ireland had been divided up into 723 dispensary districts, 215 of which were in Ulster. A further extension to the Act in 1862 extended Board of Guardians power to treat fever cases. And this is pretty significant because actually this opened the workhouse hospitals to sick people who were not destitute or poor or not likely to be workhouse inmates. So again, the Guardians were heavily involved in the administration of this system, so they had the power to issue tickets so that people could come in and see the dispensary doctor. They also were able to secure places for people with particular specific needs, people who were deaf, who were blind, putting babies out to nurse, boarding out of children, etc. And this is one of the first issues in Ireland where you see steps being taken to actively stop the prevention of contagious diseases and prevent infection by treatment of people with fever. So again, Board of Guardians had quite a significant role in health and welfare outside of purely the relief of poverty. And I mentioned boarding out of children. In 1862, the Revised Act gave them the power to board out children, and this was largely due to a report into child mortality of children within the workhouse, and particularly children under the age of 5 who were orphaned or who had no mother to care for them. There were pretty shocking death rates, and it was established that really there was no provision within the workhouse to adequately care for children of a young age. So this extended the Board of Guardians' ability to board out children, and it initially covered children up to the age of 5 and then was extended up to the age of 10 in 1869. Pauper Children Acts of 1898 and 1902 further extended that opportunity up to children aged 15 years old. And these are again a couple of very unusual to see, a couple of nice examples which have turned up in the archives. So clearly this relates to an advertisement that was placed in a local paper. Because the first letter says, I see in the paper you have 4 children to board out, and I would take them and will keep them clean, comfortable, and if I'm spared my health, I will do my best to bring them up properly. So somebody actually writing in an offering to take in boarding out of children. The next one also really interesting because somebody's writing in response to boarding out Mrs. Mulgrew's child at present in your institution, to the child's grandmother, Mrs. Haggerty of Ansborough. So you actually get some personal detail in here. And this is quite significant because prior to sort of formalised adoption, which didn't start until the into the 1930s, you know, boarding out of children and looking after children by extended family and other individuals, it's quite hard to trace and actually find any record of that or any record of who the children was with. And I know from personal cases, it's unusual to find letters like that. Sometimes you will get little snippets of information in the minute books which detail and list particular children and sometimes who they went out to and how long they were there. But it's quite a lot of work to actually trail through minute books to try and find that level of detail, and usually it just refers to something specific, like a particular individual was furnished with a new set of clothing, so it's not comprehensive. So these are some of the lovely little snippets that you would immediately find a family connection there that you might not otherwise know, particularly if a child grew up in another family. So I'll touch very quickly on the famine period because I suppose it's something that many people would associate and identify the workhouse with very clearly. By mid-1845, the potato crop had begun to rot to such a degree that there were 4 successive years of crop failure, and it was really the duration of that crop failure which caused the problems. Potatoes became completely inedible. So the government introduced a public works scheme, and again it's back to this idea of it being unacceptable to provide relief for people, or it would encourage people to sort of abuse the system if they were given handouts. So 400,000 people applied for 13,000 jobs in May 1846. And again, these were people who were probably starving anyway, and they were employed for things like wall building and the like. It was eventually abandoned in 1847, Many of the religious groups stepped in and provided soup kitchens, civil unrest. These are some of the ones that I'm sure many people have seen before. They're from the Illustrated London News, and they're an outsider's commentary of coming in and sort of illustrating these hordes of people beating a path to the workhouse door, the workhouse being full and them being unable to get in. And that's sort of, again, we talk about disease, overcrowding, poor sanitation. By 1847, stables and washrooms were being converted to accommodate more people. Disease was one of the biggest killers, as much to a degree as hunger. Fever hospitals were becoming more significant. Epidemics of particular diseases just sort of heaped on to that misery. And over 1 million people died during that period of starvation and disease. And again, these are some of the well-known Illustrated London News, particularly down the southwest coast of sort of Skibbereen and the famine villages, of just corpses being taken away from villages. So I suppose the impact of the famine had was special measures were implemented in 1847, and this was really outdoor relief, so giving relief to people who were not going to become inmates of the workhouse, but it was not available to anybody with a holding of over 1/4 of an acre. So really it really denied any outdoor relief to anybody, any of the small farmers or cottiers, and in essence it really forced thousands of people into quitting their land, either to receive relief or to leave the land or immigrate, totally changing the structure of society in the famine period. And sort of arguably, there's some historical debate as to whether that was part of the process. Part of this crisis, and again this was referred to in the Ordnance Survey memoirs, was this constant subdivision of land, population getting bigger, property that people were trying to sustain and a living on getting progressively smaller. This was not economically viable. So all of that sort of led into the mix that really there was no encouragement for people to stay on these small and unviable pieces of land. And I suppose Ulster, there has been commentary to say that Ulster got off lightly, and to a degree it probably wasn't as badly affected across the board as some of the other provinces, but there were specific examples, particularly in the west of Donegal, and also that idea of fever and disease penetrated a large part of Ulster also. So I mentioned the types of relief, and these are back to where people would generally be more used to seeking information on individuals and family members. Indoor relief was basically when people were brought into the workhouse and were resident in the workhouse. So it was really, as I said, there was only one workhouse per union, and it was really only intended for the truly destitute, particularly at the outset of workhouse systems. Families were split. We saw some of the master's commentary on what kind of food and rationing there was. It was generally pretty basic: bread, porridge, Indian meal, and very little meat was on the menu. So it was really just basic sustenance. So this is a sample from the Belfast Indoor Relief Register, and you can see it's pretty detailed. So you've got the name of the inmates, where they had resided previously, their age, employment or calling, what religious denomination they were, and in the middle, it usually tells you why they were admitted. And as time goes on, particularly from the 1900s onwards, you'll actually start to see that a lot of the reasons people were admitted to the workhouse were illness, sickness, ladies who were pregnant, somebody had broken their leg, somebody had a bad cough. Whilst there were some acts and measures instated in the early 1900s to alleviate some of these issues, really it was the Board of Guardians ran right up until the advent of the welfare state in the early 1950s, and really acted as a means of providing for people who, for whatever reason, if they were sick, were unable to work or care for their families. And I mentioned outdoor relief. This was implemented really initially to relieve some of the pressure and to provide relief for people in their own homes. It wasn't really intended for the able-bodied, particularly at the start. It was generally for to grant relief to sort of the elderly and people who were infirm and unable to work for those reasons. But it's a really useful source of information also. And up at this, I know it's difficult to see, but the first entrant in this page is James Faluna, aged 99. And under that you've got his wife Cicely Faluna, he's aged 95. So people are good age in this register. June Thompson, aged 85. A few people in their 40s, you go on down a bit, Margaret Cherry, aged 89. Rose Gwynn, aged 80. So you can see that that's actually reflected on the registers here. And it's a really nice source because it gives the name of the person, whether or not they were married, what their employment was, what their age was, the name of their wife or husband. So again, you've got immediately got a family group in here, what electoral division they came from and what townland they came from. So very, very rich in information. And I've just picked out again a few sort of random pieces of information that comes from the records. This relates to nurses who worked in for the Board of Guardians. You've got a nurse called Annie Keane. She was a trained nurse. It tells us that she was in Union Workhouse on the 18th day of October 1902 and left on the 1st of December 1904. So again, for anybody tracing family connections, it then goes on to tell us cause of leaving, having secured a better appointment in North Dublin Union. So again, you've immediately got exactly where she was based and where she was working, what she was doing for a couple of years, and then goes on to tell you exactly where she moved to, where she was employed. It tells you that her general character was excellent and that she has a highly satisfactory manner which earned her the approval of the Board of Guardians. And this is also quite an interesting document. This is talking about a man called Robert Gracie, now residing in Hamel, her house, but was born in Ballynahinch, Downpatrick. So this is basically a form. This guy is in, you can see here, this guy is in Glasgow. So the Poor Law Union in Glasgow have quite rightly worked out that he's not from Glasgow and he's not really their charge and their responsibility. So they want to repatriate him back to the other union who should be taking responsibility for him. But the richness of information in this is fabulous. It tells us that the reputed age of Robert Gracie is 51 years. And where that they would like his removal to Downpatrick Workhouse. And up here, this is particularly interesting, Robert Gracie, it tells us he has been in Glasgow for the last 13 months. And prior to that, 13 months before that, Govan 1 year, Kilmarnock 3 years, Govan 2 to 3 years, Kilmarnock 2 years. So you can see this guy's moved about. You can see what town or what area he was in and where and when and for how long. It tells us that he's a widower. And it also tells us, what does it say? It also tells us he's a partially ulcerated leg, which I suspect is the due cause of his admission to the workhouse. But again, these are, I suppose, these are not the things you usually expect to turn up in workhouse records, but you can see if somebody was looking for information on the Gracie family or Robert Gracie, you've just got a little open window of where you might want to look for records about Robert in that document. I'm aged 54 years and born at Portaferry within the Poor Law Union of Downpatrick, County Down. I came to Scotland for the first time about 12 years ago and resided at Ardrossan for 5 years. I then became unsettled and resided in various model lodging houses in Glasgow and Clydebank, and then he goes on to list them. So you can see in this deposition, that this is basically a testimonial from individuals, that he goes on to say exactly where he lived: Glendyke Street model, Glasgow Parish, Clydebank model, living no longer than 6 months at a time in any of them, nor have I resided longer than 6 months at a time in any governed parish. And goes on to tell you how often he's been chargeable and when to Glasgow Parish. So you see a wealth of information. Now, I'm showing you these as nice examples. Unfortunately, all of these examples do not exist for all of the Board of Guardians records that we hold. But I suppose they're a little example of what you might turn up or what you might want to look for, or the types of information you might find if you see these types of records listed in our Board of Guardians. And I suppose just to round up, by the end of the 19th century, the Board of Guardians powers were starting, they were on the wane basically. In 1872, the Poor Law Commissioners were dissolved and replaced by a local government board. In 1898, the Local Government Act basically reduced the Guardians' power back down to purely provision for the poor, and county councils took over all of the other provisions, so that was care for patients with mental health, deaf, blind, etc. In addition, the grand juries were replaced by the county councils, and I suppose this also ties in with the reduction of power of the big land estate owners and the ascendancy per se. So really, this was starting to change the functionality of the Board of Guardians, and as I said, they did continue to provide a role right up to they were actually replaced in the early 1950s by the welfare state. So in terms of the unions and the records that PRONI holds, there's a list of them here. They're listed in our archive under the prefix BG, standing for Board of Guardians. They're available and searchable on the electronic catalogue on PRONI's website, so you can go in and have a look for the union you're interested in. There's over 7,000 volumes and around 7,000 documents across the archive. In terms of, so there are complete sets of minute books covering 1839 to 48 for most of those unions, and we saw some extracts from the minute books. There's a bit of work involved in working your way through them, but you can really find a great deal of detail, sometimes relating to individuals, but often just relating to administration and the social provision of the time. And where the sets are incomplete, there are really only a few missing most of the time. Belfast Board of Guardians records cover the period 45 to 1932, and they also cover the 32 outdoor relief riots, which resulted in civil unrest here in Belfast. So as you've seen, you've had a little flavour of what the archive deals with: administration of the workhouse, relieving of the poor, issues relating to emigration in places. You've got things like minute books, indoor relief registers, out registers. Some unions will have records of births and deaths. Some will have admission and discharge registers which exist. Again, it's just a matter of finding the union for which you're interested in and looking what's survived. So really, as you can imagine, there's a lot of personal information recorded in the Board of Guardians records. So the more recent records are subject to 100-year closure. So that basically relates to the terminal date on the volume. So in places like Belfast, you'll have volumes, you could maybe have 2 indoor relief register volumes per year. Such was the vast turnover of people coming through the system. So you'll get, those will open pretty quickly. In some of the smaller unions, for example, you could have a register which covers maybe a 5-year period. So basically you just have to wait until the terminal date, the very last date on that register, before the actual volume becomes open. And as I said, that's generally because, as I'm sure most of you are aware, there has traditionally been a stigma attached to people who were in and out of the workhouse, even up to very, very recent years. So this is to protect the privacy and for data protection reasons for people who may well still be alive and not want things like disease, mental illness, illegitimacy, that kind of information to be disclosed. That doesn't mean you can't access specific information relating to individuals. So if you believe that an ancestor relative has passed through the workhouse system, you can, if the record is closed, you can make a request to PRONI in writing. So that can be a written letter, or it can also be an email. Put down the details you know. A member of staff in PRONI can then identify, are there any relevant records? Have a look for any relevant information in the records. What happens is that we would liaise with what we call the functionally responsible department. So basically who's taken over the functionality of what the Board of Guardians would have done, which is currently DHSSPS. So we would liaise with them. If they're content, what usually happens is that specific information is released to the individual. So you don't get to see the whole register, but an extract of the information relating particularly to your request can be released to you. Yes, there's no charge for that. So as I said, just put in the details that you know and put in a written request to PRONI if you believe that there's somebody you're interested in who's passed through the workhouse system. And there are also extracts from minute books listed up in the public search room in PRONI. So if you just want to have a look and see what kind of information there is without ordering specific books out, you can go and have a look and see that in a bit more detail up in the public search room.